progressive disclosure of complexity.
This is a space that is very hot.
A little weird and strange.
All these panels and buttons and menus and all this stuff, and it's like, do I need to know about all of this up front?
Here's what I want to happen. The compiler takes care of all of that.
Nobody wants to touch that. We never will find that button. Two reasons that React really took off. We don't build services to make money. We make money so we can keep building better services. Behold, this is the answer. We've finally done it. You're doing the same thing over and over across lots of different companies. It's very hard to change developer behavior.
All right, we are here live at React Summit. I'm K-Ball from JS Party. I'm joined by my co-host here.
I'm Nick. Ahoy, hoy.
Hoy, hoy. And we have a special guest here today with us. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Okino. I was a part of the founding team of React at Facebook, now Meta. And these days I'm the chief product officer at Vercel.
Given that we are at React Summit, I'm sure we have to go into the story. So tell us a little bit behind the scenes. What was it like getting React started?
Yeah, well, how long do you want, what version do you want? How long do you want me to speak for? I could go for 5 minutes or 5 hours.
Well, I mean, you've told this story again and again. We got to start with it, but let's keep it tight, and then we'll try to get into what are some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that maybe hasn't come out before.
Yeah, sounds good. So in the early days, I think we were exploring a number of different ways to build web applications. And on the sort of ads side of our business, we had some more sophisticated applications than on the consumer side. The way that we were kind of building those at the time was the same way that everybody was building web apps, was sort of a client-side MVC. It was not, dissimilar to something like Backbone or Ember or Angular at the time. An engineer came along and he's like, look, this code is very hard to maintain. As our team grows, we're moving very slowly. Nobody wants to touch that 1,000-line model over there. Only 2 people can touch that. And so he thought there was a better way. He was inspired by a bunch of things that we had already been doing in other parts of the business. But from that, a prototype of an early version of what would eventually become React was born. At the time, I think we didn't have the right home in the company inside of the ads business to sort of incubate that type of new technology. So Jordan came over and talked to some of us on the product infrastructure team, where we built frameworks and technologies that enabled other developers to be more efficient and build higher quality stuff. We gave it 5 minutes. We tried to build some things with it. We knew there was something important there. And that's when we kind of started to double down. And the rest you can hear about in the documentary or in one of the other interviews. But yeah, it was very much grew out of this organic sort of need, this emergent need for a simpler way of thinking about and developing our apps.
I'm curious, in ads before that, were you using something that's familiar, or was it more like an in-house solution? I'm just curious, what drove the need to React?
Yeah, it was something in-house, but it was not unfamiliar. I mean, one of the people that co-created our in-house framework, which was called Bolt, was a core contributor to Backbone. Okay. We also had folks from the sort of Dojo mobile team. We were very much in the soup of the JavaScript ecosystem at the time. And so yeah, I would compare our sort of in-house framework to sort of Backbone with a different way of doing the sort of view layer. And it was good, very good. And we used it for a very long time. And it wasn't until our team started to get bigger and our app started to get sort of pathologically complex that we started to need a simpler model, no pun intended. We had these massive controllers and these massive models that nobody really wanted to touch, so many inputs. And we couldn't make changes with confidence. That's when you're kind of looking at it and you're like, okay, I think there's maybe a simpler way to do this.
Well, and one of the things that React introduced that was so different, and that I remember, you were at that JS Conf when it was announced, right? And you announced and you talk about, all right, we're going to put JSX in here. We're going to have everything in one component. We're not going to separate concerns. And it was panned.
Yeah.
I remember, I was not at the conference you were, but I just remember the ripple effects coming out and people were like, what the heck is this?
Yes. Yeah, when Jordan and I introduced it at that conference, I remember it vividly. One of the things we wanted to focus on was the sort of syntax and how this thing that was very familiar to us, we thought would be also familiar to the rest of the world. It's look, your HTML, the way that you want to think about your components, you don't have to use these nested JSON structures and all this stuff. Look, it just looks like HTML. But the sort of conversation ended up becoming about this mixing of technologies. And at the time, it was like, no, the whole industry is moving towards a separation of concerns, and you guys are mashing them together. And we're like, wait, this is one concern. It's my component. It's my UI. And so I think the biggest thing we did wrong there was we didn't actually start with the problems that we were trying to solve. We just started with our solution.
Yeah.
So luckily, Pete Hunt, I think later the same year at JSConf EU, did a much better job of like teeing up the problem. Here's what we were experiencing as our applications got more complicated, as our models got super big, people didn't want to make changes to them. We wanted loose coupling between components so that those components could be used in lots of places, but high cohesion between them. So how do you do that? And it's with the seam between components, which is the props boundary and all these other things. So he did a much better job of teeing up the problem, and then I think it was more well accepted. People were willing to kind of give it 5 minutes after that point. But I'm glad that there wasn't like a stampeding herd of adoption. This is amazing. At no point in React's history have we ever said, behold, this is the answer. We've finally done it. It's always been about, sort of like, here's the problems we were facing. Here's one solution that worked pretty well for us. If you have the same problems, let's chat. If not, no worries. There's lots of good solutions out there. But I'm glad that, Pete came through and restored faith in the sort of engineering team that Jordan and I were attempting to represent, because the team was great and the tech was novel, something interesting.
Yeah, I think it really, like being there, I had a tweet in the React documentary that was negative towards it. It was because like that separation of concerns, everything was pushed towards that. And then like also just creating this new JSX syntax that like wasn't real JavaScript at the time felt a little weird and strange. But I think that the key piece, like looking back, that was missing was that component mindset. Like we just weren't thinking in terms of components. Like for me, I was in Backbone in those days, and it was really more thinking about in terms of the model that is the view that I'm specifically showing, which at the time was usually like a page.
Yeah, that's right. The views, in our applications ended up being massive.
Yeah.
And then the models that needed to power those views were massive. And you could break them up. You could say like, okay, now I have multiple models that feed up into this thing, and now I have multiple views. But everybody was thinking about things from a sort of like, top down, rather than a sort of the component as the atom, inside out sort of mentality. And that was the big shift. Was we're going to define a seam, and I can do anything I want inside of this seam, but the contract with the rest of the application is intact.
Yeah.
And we could have done a better job of telling that story, but it worked out okay in the end.
Well, and that approach to decomposing user interfaces has taken over the world, right? Like everything is now using component-oriented development, whether it's using JSX or something else, even if you're still doing separation of concerns in the traditional way, you're still thinking about it as components.
That's right. Yeah, the day that Swift UI was announced, I remember writing Jordan and saying, congratulations, man. We did it.
Yeah.
The thing that we were so against was this idea that engineers should spend their time manually manipulating views, updating things based on new information coming in. And we just wanted the framework to be able to take care of that for you. And now across every platform, every UI behaves that way. We have a declarative way of describing what our components and our UI should look like at any point in time, and you trust the framework to keep it up to date. We never will find that button and turn the text red or set its state to disabled manually ever again. I think that's progress.
Yeah. When React was first coming out and like that first version, it really was just focused on kind of the view layer and like displaying things. Here's the props and here's how they're going to be displayed. And then here's the interactions between them. Was that a conscious decision to keep it very limited to that and not to spread out into more like state business logic?
Yeah, I think it was sort of an implementation detail leaking out. I think, we wanted to do one thing really well, but more importantly, we just had all this other stuff that this was sitting on top of. We had a way of doing data fetching at Facebook. We had a way of doing basically everything. Our router was like a server-based router. Like, we really didn't need to solve all of the concerns.
Yeah.
But over time, what happened is the community ended up filling in all the gaps. We needed a router, and then React Router came around. React needed server-side rendering, and then I think like Pinterest was maybe the first company to build a server-side renderer that would work because Facebook didn't run JavaScript on the server at the time, and so we weren't investing in server-side rendering, but the architecture was very much designed with server-side rendering in mind. So you needed all of these things, state management libraries and different types of integrations, and the community really filled in the gaps. And then I think the goal for the core team over time was to make it so that all of these things that were built on top of React could get thinner and thinner. They didn't have to be so sophisticated because the framework would take care of more of the atomic, low-level complexities for you, so that your framework that sits on top of this library that's growing in size could be thinner and thinner, but just as expressive. So yeah, I mean, there was no sort of intentional, let's not worry about any of that because the community will fill it in. It was like, well, that's not what we need to solve, so we'll kind of create an opportunity for the world to fill in the gaps. And that's when I think, React, we introduced it very clearly as a library. Is this a library or a framework? It's not a framework. It doesn't do everything for you. Ember was batteries included, and that was beautiful. Angular was the same way. Here's how you do testing. Here's how you do data fetching. Here's how you do routing. We were just like, nah, this is just your views. And a lot of the early adoption of React actually used it in conjunction with backbone models.
Yeah.
So there was even a strong relationship between, Instagram did this in the early days where we had backbone feeding into React views, and it was just an easier way to do your view layer.
Yeah. And I think that probably really helped with the adoption of it too, just because it was a simple way to do it, and it wasn't prescribing this is the one way to do it, and people got to really experiment, and then these new experiments just flooded the market with all sorts of different ways to do it.
That's exactly right. I think there's sort of two reasons that React really took off. One was you could adopt it extremely incrementally. One part of your page, not even one page in your app, one piece of your page. And the other thing was the other direction. So it included these escape hatches from the early days. And I remember we had one of these things where we had this very sophisticated autocomplete widget that no one wanted to re-implement. It was just really complicated. And so there was this function in React that said find DOM node, and it would get you the DOM node that you needed, and then you could decorate it with whatever existing sort of jQuery-like application code you had or behavior you had, and then you could mix and match. And so because we created sort of escape hatches and incremental adoption for our own needs, by the way, this wasn't a strategy, this is how we'll get, no one ever cared about React adoption at Facebook. No one ever took a goal on number of external React users. But we needed to build these things for ourselves, and it turned out those are the things that made it possible for other companies to try it and then eventually expand their usage.
You were at Facebook. React at Facebook is for their own needs. Now you've moved on, you're at Vercel, which is also supporting a lot of these open source front-end movements, but perhaps a little bit more self-interestedly in some ways.
There is a business there, yeah. It's very interesting, the contrast. One of the things I've loved about being at Vercel versus Facebook was Facebook had a business that was over there that was funding everything that we needed to do, and it was enough for us to make our own engineers more efficient, to level up the quality of our applications. But we didn't really have to concern ourselves with how other companies are adopting our technologies. So that means that, we collaborate, we build an open source community, we benefit from recruiting and thought leadership and all these things. But there was no sort of on the balance sheet, here's the value that we derive. And I think being able to invest in open source technologies from the angle of there's kind of a business that's funding the open source development, but I'm more directly connected to the customers has been a really enlightening and great experience. We now can talk about business outcomes for our customers and how the sort of frameworks and the technologies that we built led to those business outcomes. But one of the things that both companies kind of have in common is Facebook famously said, we don't build services to make money. We make money so we can keep building better services. And Vercel's kind of the same way now with open source investment. We don't build Next.js to make money. We have a business that makes money so that we can keep funding Next.js development. I like being more directly connected to the customers and seeing the ways that our framework improvements enable them to achieve better business outcomes, which is a much more direct link than I had at Facebook.
So you said the need for React kind of came out of this very complicated JavaScript application that those of us who are older remember all of these, the spaghetti was the way, right? And you're trying to track the dependencies. And so React kind of reimagined that, broke that down, filled the gap there. Where do you see right now that same kind of, if anywhere, like places where people are getting stuck, where like there needs to be some sort of reimagining of the paradigm?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift that we saw was in moving a lot of that application complexity into components, where those components primarily contain, or not primarily, but those components contain everything that they need in order to exist inside of a larger application, and on their own. We just moved a lot of the complexity into those components, but on the client. And we moved so much of the application onto the client that I think we've had like a 5-year run of like single page apps that like show a loading spinner or a series of loading spinners, and then they fetch their own data from wherever it's coming from. And that led to a better developer experience, but admittedly, probably not the right user experience. And there's things that you can do in order to coalesce the data fetching and make sure that you don't have waterfalls in your app. But it's kind of manual, it's not the default. So I think the biggest shift we have is moving some of the work back to the server when it belongs on the server. You're doing data fetching code, you're doing anything that hits a database or touches secrets or anything, and you can leave that code where it belongs and then ship a thinner client. And the thing that I'm kind of most excited about is using both the server and the client for the things that they're best at. Client is best for interactivity and real-time, immediate optimistic feedback. But the server is best for sort of orchestrating data fetching and coalescing things and sort of making it so that we have an efficient, stream of updates coming to the page. And so I think when you have a static shell and then you stream in the dynamic bits of your app, but you keep everything interactive as the streams come in, I think that's kind of the North Star for web application delivery. And that's the shift we're seeing with like React Server components. So we're far closer to the beginning of the RSC journey than the end there. And that's the shift I'm most excited about. But then I think there's this renaissance of sort of like wanting to support in a more native way other devices and other platforms that have been coming online. It's not just about mobile anymore. It's also about TVs and AR, VR, et cetera. So we're going to see a proliferation of new clients that you want to support. And my hope is that this blend of the benefits of the server and the benefits of the client won't be lost as we move to all these new platforms.
It really seems like trying to get the best of both worlds in terms of developer experience and user experience.
Yeah. One of the things I feel really strongly about is developer experience was never a goal on its own. Mm-hmm. Developer experience is always in service of creating a better user experience. The reason that we needed to improve the developer experience in sort of our sophisticated ads code base was because we needed engineers to be able to keep iterating on it and making improvements based on customer feedback and what we saw. So it wasn't like we were like, oh, we just want to clean this up so we can have a better time ourselves. It's necessary in order to deliver the best user experience possible. So I think anybody who says that these things trade off against each other, I think they can, but they shouldn't.
Yes.
We need to make the defaults for anything that any framework outputs significantly higher quality and sort of raise the baseline for everything. One of our goals is sort of level up the entire web. We want to make the web better. I want to use software that feels great, not software that looks like it was cobbled together really quickly. Even if you can develop it quickly, that doesn't mean it has to feel like crap. So developer experience in service of a great user experience.
So you were around for the beginning of React and kind of bringing that into the limelight and getting all of the popularity that it has and shaping the industry. And now, years later, you're at Vercel doing Next. Do you see that as like a continuation of React or a way to shape React for like 2024 and beyond, like the modern, the way that you might have built React in today's world as opposed to 10 years ago?
So in many ways, I think that what we're doing at Vercel is sort of inevitable, and React is an important piece of that, but not the sort of high order bit. So let me describe what I mean by that. Generally speaking, it's very hard to change developer behavior. But if you can do it, it affords you this ability to do some other interesting stuff. One of the things that I really like about the sort of arc of Vercel is I believe that there's sort of like a human progress element here. There used to be, and I'm talking about managed infrastructure, so just to like not bury the lead. We used to, literally when I joined Facebook, we had teams that drove to data centers and rack-mounted machines. And I knew that team. The infrastructure team would like drive and rack mount machines and connect it to the internet and call ISPs. And then, eventually AWS comes along. And you don't have to do that anymore. Somebody's already done that, and now we can provision compute on demand. You just log into the console, you say how many machines you need, you configure them, and then something like Vercel comes along, and no one has to do that anymore. So the arc is sort of like human progress happens when you take something that a small set of specialists can do, only a small set of specialists. You make it so anyone can do it, and then you make it so no one has to. And the reason I'm so interested in this arc for technology is because I've seen time and time again, many, many companies do what I've described as undifferentiated heat loss engineering. You're doing the same thing over and over across lots of different companies where you're provisioning compute manually, you anticipate a spike because of some event that's happening, so you provision some more manually, or you build a script that sort of like tries to do this automatically for you, but then you didn't handle automatic failover, so like what if this data center goes down, now you have to have somebody log in and do this thing, and you didn't handle what happens when you like deploy your app, and then somebody's using it actively, and then everything breaks, so you didn't handle deployment skew, and there's all this stuff, and most of the software in the world, because every company is doing the same thing, they're not thinking about it as holistically or as completely as Google or Facebook or now Vercel. And so what we're trying to do at Vercel is make it so that all of the concerns associated with provisioning compute, configuring your data center or your infrastructure primitives, all of that is handled for you automatically. And the reason I'm so interested in Next.js and React is because one of the only ways that we can define infrastructure for you automatically on demand is by having the framework define that infrastructure. So we can certainly do it with more than just Next.js, but we have to conform to some sort of a scheme that describes to the system how to provision infrastructure on demand. And so that's where framework-defined infrastructure comes from, and the build output API and a bunch of other primitives. So very much sort of innovating with Next.js and Vercel's managed infrastructure, but then generalizing after the fact. So again, this is another case where we want high cohesion between the infrastructure and the framework, very high cohesion. So we build them and develop them and innovate on them in tandem, but we want loose coupling. So we really clearly define the seam between the two. This is the build output API. If your framework that you invent today conforms to the build output API, Vercel's managed infrastructure can deploy it for you on demand and auto scale it. And the same thing goes for the infrastructure. The infrastructure is influenced by, but decoupled from, so that it can be used to deploy anything, including Python and PHP very soon. Yeah, we're kind of like building managed infrastructure that is influenced by the code that you write, so that no one has to manually provision compute again.
There's something really interesting there in terms of like creating constraints for your architecture that then enable you to automatically infer a set of different things. I'm curious, because I'm not super familiar with the build output API or anything. What are, at a high level, not if I'm not using Next.js, or maybe because it'll deal with it for me, what are the constraints I need to put on my software architecture that allow you to automatically scale and manage it?
Yeah, at the most sort of rudimentary level is this idea that when a page loads or when an application is loaded, is this specific resource static or dynamic? Is this something that can be loaded from a CDN, loaded from a cache, replicated out to dozens of regions so that it can be just delivered directly to the browser? Or is this something that requires some compute? So is this dynamic? And if it's dynamic, let's say it's a cart or a user profile or some information about the visitor, then you'll need to provision some type of compute on demand. And that could come from a sort of like base layer of compute, or it could come from on-demand serverless functions. We're sort of redefining the way that you think about that to be a much more fluid boundary between the two. So you don't have to think about whether something is going to be on-demand serverless or come from base compute. You just think about whether it's dynamic or not. And then when you tell the framework, when you tell the managed infrastructure, hey, this is a dynamic piece, it will provision the necessary compute in a very efficient way. This is a very like high-level static versus dynamic, but there's more flavors. Like what's your caching strategy and how do you mix these things?
Well, and how do you think about stateful resources, right? Especially if you go beyond the simple databases.
Yeah, that's right. And what we want to enable is anybody to pull in any stateful resources, whether it's databases and any dynamic resources. So backends, I mean, AI apps are huge these days. We need efficient compute, efficient on-demand compute for talking to long-lived LLM outputs, right, that are streaming responses back. This is not the like, go fetch rows from the database of yore, right, where you just like synchronously just fetch some rows from a database. Now we have like much more sophisticated stateful and dynamic backends, and we need to be able to connect to all of them.
So let's maybe dive in on that LLM side a little bit. This is a space that is very hot. It's also a space where most of the apps out there are, I don't know if we're PG or not, but terrible. We'll use that word. Because we're still trying to understand what are the primitives, what are the pieces that actually make sense for an LLM-based application.
Yeah.
I know y'all are diving into that with things like V0 and things like that. What is your perception of what the application layer needs? You know, we've had tremendous development at the model layer, but what does the application layer need to be for LLM success?
First is that we're far closer to the sort of beginning of that journey as well than the end. And I think we're seeing right now LLMs level up developers. Every developer now is like a super developer because you can move much faster. But I think I'm more interested in the UX side of things. And so one kind of innovation here is this idea of LLMs not just outputting static content, so images and text, but also outputting dynamic
Generative UI.
Yeah. That's right. So Gen UI, I think this idea that, you know, in the simplest form, this is a chatbot, but you can interact with some of the messages that come back. Great, we've seen that. But what happens when we apply Gen UI into places where very complicated UI wasn't previously progressively disclosed? I think it will make our applications, if we do this right, much more approachable, but the sort of full sophistication of those applications can be disclosed progressively. And you know, we used to have physical buttons for everything that you wanted to do on a radio. Then we got soft buttons that would be context aware and give you an option. Then we got touch screens that would say, okay, here's all the stuff. You can just touch on the screen, and the screen had a hard-coded set of sort of UIs that you could sift through. And now I think we will be able to have on-demand UI, and it'll still conform to conventional patterns. A button needs to look like a button, but it'll be able to be custom tailored for your experience, which I think will end up being much less, you know, software can be much less overwhelming. I remember the first time I opened Photoshop, or like Framer has this too, where like there's just all these panels and buttons and menus and all this stuff, and it's like, do I need to know about all of this up front? And so I think with Gen UI and with you know, the sort of like modern era of UX development, we will be able to progressively disclose that stuff contextually when you need it and not sort of upfront. So I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about the idea that like, I don't know, LLMs are better at raising the baseline for everyone than I think most. And so what that means is like, hey, now that we finally have a really great feeling date picker, let's use that, or let's use, you know, let's let the like top date pickers compete, so that I never get into that situation where like, oh God, like I can't select, I have to click 15 times in order to get to. So I think like we'll be able to more quickly, I hope, zero in on like optimal user experiences, especially on different modes, right? So if I'm on mobile versus desktop, I hope that we will be able to level up the user experience across the board. I don't want LLMs to contribute to a proliferation of low-quality apps. I really want to see LLMs enable us all to improve quality and raise the quality floor for all software that we all use.
Yeah, I love what you talked about there of like an LLM integrated application doesn't have to just be a chatbot.
That's right.
It can do these other things. And I think a transformation similar to what you were talking about with React, where you moved from a mode where you're very imperative, you're having to say this data goes here, this data goes here, to something that is much more declarative. Here's what I want to happen.
That's right.
The compiler takes care of all of that. And some of the best Gen AI applications I've seen do something similar, where they take a user interface that used to be very imperative, thinking some of Adobe's tools.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
I used to have to do this, color here, do this. And now I say, make it look like a sky background, and it will just do it.
Yeah, that's right. So it was declarative UI, right? React sort of pioneered this idea of describe what your application looks like at any point in time. And maybe the era of LLMs, just to connect to the analogy, is describe your application at any point in time. So it's not just what it looks like now. Now it's how it behaves. There's a tweet going around with use AI, when. And actually, I think that directive is not that far off. You'll kind of describe what your application is supposed to do, and if we can ensure that the same, predictable behavior and outcomes happen, we'll be able to. We're in this sort of era, entering the era of personal software, I think. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I think to K-Ball's analogy of being able to just quickly replace the sky, one thing we were talking about last night was we could both do that and get two different skies right now. But talking to you, I think maybe using Gen AI, or not Gen AI, but just AI to help you guide through the deterministic outcomes that you want. So don't give me everything in Photoshop right away, but when I describe what I want to do, you can point me at the right tools and kind of catch at a funnel how anyone might describe what they want and then push me to the right tools.
Yeah, progressive disclosure of complexity.
Yeah, I like that.
Shifting gears slightly, so we're here at React Summit. All sorts of interesting things going on. You're here, obviously, speaking, talking to us, doing these things. What is your sense of conferences 2024? We've gone through this whole dynamic of okay, pandemic, nobody's going to anything, virtual conferences are miserable. All these different things, and they're not miserable. They're good, but they're not the same.
That's right.
So how would you talk to folks who are saying, oh, I'm not at React, so I'm watching this virtually. Should I go? Why should I go?
It doesn't need to be necessarily this one, but I think getting together in person with people in the field, in the same space, and sharing ideas and building off of each other, that's what the magic is. When we created the first React Conf, 2015, we started working on it in 2014, I think our goal was to bring some of the community together and tell some, here's the latest updates. But the value that we got out of it was we literally built lifelong friendships. Yeah. And many of the people that you still see speaking at all of these conferences today and now in the industry, their first React-related conference was React Conf, and now they're all sort of bonded over that experience. Pandemic hit all of us very hard. I think I thrive on collaborating in person with folks. I really missed it. So it's really good to be here. Even just this morning so far, leading up to this sort of opening ceremonies, just all of the conversations and just hearing what people are working on and what they build. And yeah, you can't replace that. So even if it's a local meetup, get out and connect with people.
Yeah, support your local meetups.
Yeah, agreed.
Absolutely. I think we're just about at time. Anything you want to leave people with?
I think it's been a fun journey so far, watching the evolution of React and the community and the sort of families of technologies around this. I think one of the things that I was very excited about that I didn't necessarily see as a goal in the early days of React was how it's sort of reignited interest in the web as a platform.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I'm really heartened by all of the active development and innovation happening on the web as a platform. I'm a big proponent of sort of making the web win. The web is where I cut my teeth, and I know a lot of us as well, ever since the MooTools days, or even before that, Prototype and Dojo and all that stuff. So big fan of continued investment in web technologies and the web platform, and happy and excited to connect with anybody who shares that passion. So
yeah.
Thanks guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.